The whispers started in the trading floors of London and New York around 3 in the morning, when the first batch of Asian market data rolled in. And what those numbers revealed sent a shockwave through an industry that has existed for millennia. Because silver, that lustrous metal that has been currency, jewelry, industrial component, and store of value since ancient civilizations first discovered it gleaming in the earth, was behaving in ways that defied every model, every prediction, every carefully constructed hedge that dealers had built their empires upon. On this particular morning in early 2025, silver alert dealers, those specialized traders who make markets in physical silver and derivatives, found themselves staring at screens that showed a price divergence so severe between physical metal and paper contracts that the very foundation of their business model was cracking beneath their feet. And the panic that ensued was not the theatrical panic of movies but the cold, calculated terror of professionals who suddenly realized that the game they thought they understood had changed its rules without warning. To understand why seasoned dealers, men and women who had weathered the 1980 Hunt Brothers Silver Corner, the 2008 financial crisis, and countless smaller disruptions, were now frantically calling counterparties at ungodly hours, we need to understand what silver means in the modern economy, because unlike gold, which sits mostly in vaults as a store of value, silver is consumed, literally destroyed in industrial processes. Used in everything from solar panels to electronics, from medical equipment to water purification systems, making it simultaneously a precious metal and an industrial commodity, a dual nature that creates unique supply and demand dynamics. The dealers who trade silver operate in a world of razor-thin margins, making their profits not from dramatic price swings, but from the spread between buying and selling prices, from arbitrage opportunities between different markets, from the careful management of inventory levels that balance the need to serve customers against the cost of holding metal, and this business model depends absolutely on one fundamental assumption: that prices across different markets and different forms of silver will remain roughly aligned, allowing dealers to hedge their physical metal positions with paper contracts, to move metal between locations knowing that price relationships will hold, to sleep at night confident that their carefully balanced books will not implode due to some bizarre market dislocation. But that assumption was now proving catastrophically wrong, because the physical silver market, the actual metal you can hold in your hand, was trading at premiums to paper silver that hadn't been seen in generations, premiums of 10, 15, even 20% in some cases, and these weren't temporary blips but sustained divergences that had been building for weeks and had now reached critical mass. The immediate trigger was a confluence of factors that individually might have been manageable but together created a perfect storm. Industrial demand for silver in the renewable energy sector had exploded as countries rushed to meet climate commitments, with solar panel production alone consuming silver at rates that exceeded even optimistic forecasts, while simultaneously, investment demand had surged as inflation fears and currency debasement concerns drove investors toward tangible assets, and perhaps most critically, the physical supply chains that move silver from mines to refiners to dealers to end users had developed bottlenecks that no amount of money seemed able to immediately resolve. A dealer in Zurich who had sold forward contracts for physical delivery found himself unable to source the metal at anywhere near the price he had contracted to deliver it, facing the prospect of either defaulting on contracts, something that would destroy his reputation and potentially his business, or paying catastrophic premiums in the physical market to fulfill his obligations, losses that would wipe out months or even years of carefully accumulated profits. In London, the historic heart of precious metals trading where dealers had operated from the same buildings for centuries, emergency meetings were convened as firms tried to assess their total exposure, because the interconnected nature of the market meant that one firm's default could cascade through the system, creating a domino effect that could bring down even well-capitalized dealers and the memories of past crises. Particularly the near collapse of the London Metal Exchange nickel market in 2022 were fresh enough to make everyone acutely aware of how quickly orderly markets could disintegrate into chaos. The psychology of a dealer panic is fascinating because these are not unsophisticated investors prone to emotional decision-making, but rather highly trained professionals with decades of experience. Yet even they are subject to the same fundamental fear that grips anyone who suddenly realizes they may have made a catastrophic miscalculation. And in the case of silver dealers in early 2025, that miscalculation was the assumption that the paper and physical markets would remain tightly coupled, an assumption that seemed so fundamental, so obvious, so supported by decades of history that questioning it would have seemed paranoid, yet here they were watching that assumption disintegrate in real time. The phone calls that morning were exercises in controlled desperation, dealers calling their mining contacts to secure physical metal, calling their banking partners to arrange emergency financing, calling their legal teams to understand their options if contracts couldn't be fulfilled, calling their competitors in that peculiar dance where sworn rivals must sometimes cooperate to prevent systemic collapse, because they all understand that a complete market breakdown would hurt everyone. One veteran dealer in New York, a man who had traded through every crisis of the past 40 years, later described the feeling as similar to being a pilot who discovers mid-flight that the laws of physics have subtly changed. The plane is still flying, but the instruments are giving readings that make no sense, and every instinct developed over a lifetime of experience is suddenly unreliable, forcing you to navigate by guesswork and hope in a situation where guesswork can be fatal. The historical context makes the panic more understandable, because silver has always been a metal of paradoxes and surprises, its price volatility far exceeding gold's despite being often discussed in the same breath, and the history of silver markets is littered with spectacular blow-ups. From the aforementioned Hunt Brothers episode when two Texas billionaires tried to corner the entire silver market and nearly succeeded before regulatory intervention and margin calls forced them to capitulate, causing silver to crash from $50 an ounce to below $11 in just 4 days, a collapse that destroyed fortunes and created a cautionary tale that every dealer knew by heart. But the current situation was different because this wasn't manipulation or speculation, but rather a fundamental mismatch between supply and demand exacerbated by structural changes in how silver flows through the global economy, changes that had been building slowly, almost invisibly, until they reached a critical threshold and suddenly became impossible to ignore. The renewable energy revolution, that grand transformation towards sustainable power that governments worldwide had committed to with binding treaties and massive subsidies, had created an insatiable appetite for silver because photovoltaic solar cells, the technology that converts sunlight to electricity, require silver paste for their electrical contacts, and while researchers work constantly to reduce the amount of silver needed per panel. The explosive growth in solar installations has overwhelmed any efficiency gains, with some analysts estimating that solar alone could consume more silver annually than the entire mining industry produces, a calculation that seemed absurd until you looked at the actual numbers and realized it was not only possible but perhaps inevitable. Electric vehicles, that other pillar of the green transition, also use substantially more silver than traditional cars due to their extensive electrical systems. Charging infrastructure requires silver, wind turbines use it, 5G networks need it, and suddenly the industrial demand that had always been one component of silver's market profile was becoming the dominant factor, overwhelming the investment and monetary demand that had historically driven prices. The dealers who were panicking had understood these trends intellectually, had read the reports, had seen the forecasts, but had somehow failed to internalize what it would mean for their actual business, when physical metal became genuinely scarce not because of hoarding or speculation, but because industrial users were consuming it faster than mines could produce it and recycling could reclaim it, creating a structural deficit that would take years to resolve even under optimistic scenarios. The supply side of the equation offered no comfort, because unlike many metals where high prices quickly bring new production online, silver mining is peculiar in that most silver is actually produced as a byproduct of mining for other metals, primarily zinc, lead, and copper, meaning that silver supply doesn't respond quickly or directly to silver prices, but rather to the economics of those other metals, creating an inelastic supply curve that can't rapidly adjust to sudden demand surges. New primary silver mines take years to develop, from exploration to permitting to construction to production, and the mining industry, burned by past cycles of boom and bust, has become cautious about committing capital to new projects, preferring to return cash to shareholders rather than bet on sustained high prices that might evaporate before expensive new mines reach production. The geopolitics of silver supply added another layer of complexity, because major producing countries like Mexico, Peru, and China each had their own policy priorities that might or might not align with the global need for increased production, with resource nationalism an ever-present risk that could see governments restrict exports or impose royalties that made marginal mines uneconomic. Recycling, often touted as a solution to supply constraints, faced the challenge that silver used in industrial applications is often dispersed in such small quantities across millions of devices that recovering it is economically impractical at current prices, meaning that unlike gold where most of what has ever been mined still exists in some recoverable form, much of the silver used in modern technology is effectively lost, consumed in a way that removes it from the supply pool permanently. The dealers who were frantically working their phones that morning understood all of this at some level, but understanding something as an abstract concept is very different from living through its concrete manifestation in your own profit and loss statement, and the gap between intellectual knowledge and visceral experience was being closed with brutal efficiency as they watched their hedge positions fail to perform as expected, their physical inventory prove insufficient to meet obligations. Their carefully constructed risk management frameworks reveal themselves as inadequate to the new reality. The regulatory dimension of the crisis added fuel to the fire because while regulators in various jurisdictions had extensive frameworks for dealing with financial market disruptions, the physical commodity markets often fell into regulatory gaps, with unclear jurisdictions and limited tools for intervention, meaning that dealers couldn't necessarily count on a regulatory backstop if things spiraled out of control. A realization that made the panic more acute because it meant they were truly on their own, sink or swim based on their own resources and decisions with no guarantee of a rescue if they got it wrong. Some dealers began quietly approaching their largest clients to renegotiate contracts, delicate conversations where they had to acknowledge that they might not be able to deliver metal at agreed prices while simultaneously trying to maintain the relationship and avoid triggering a rush to the exits that would make their situation even worse. A tightrope walk that required tremendous skill and often more luck than skill. Because sophisticated clients understood leverage and were not above using a dealer's desperation to extract concessions or even switch to competitors. The larger institutional players in the silver market, the big banks and trading houses that make markets and provide liquidity, faced their own dilemmas because they had responsibilities to the broader market ecosystem that went beyond their individual profit and loss, serving as crucial intermediaries that kept physical metal flowing from producers to consumers, and if they withdrew from the market or radically tightened their terms, the disruption would ripple across industries that depended on reliable silver supply, from electronics manufacturers to renewable energy companies to medical device makers, potentially creating real-world consequences far beyond financial losses. Behind closed doors, industry groups were convening emergency calls to discuss collective responses, whether to approach regulators about temporary relief from certain reporting requirements, whether to pool resources to secure physical metal, whether to collectively approach major mining companies about forward purchases. All while navigating antitrust concerns and the natural competitive instincts that made cooperation difficult even in crisis. Because no dealer wanted to reveal the full extent of their problems to competitors who might use that information to poach clients or gain market share. The media, sensing a story, began making inquiries, but dealers were caught between the need to maintain confidence and the risk that if they denied problems too forcefully and then failed to deliver metal, the reputational damage would be even worse. So they settled on carefully worded statements about challenging market conditions and unprecedented demand dynamics that said everything and nothing simultaneously, buying time to work through their positions while trying to avoid triggering the very panic they feared. Individual traders within dealer firms were living their own personal crises, because their bonuses, their careers, their professional reputations were tied to their books, and a catastrophic loss in this environment could end a career that had taken decades to build, creating intense personal pressure that manifested in sleepless nights, stress-related health issues, and the kind of grinding anxiety that comes from knowing you're in a situation largely beyond your control where the outcome will determine your professional fate. The irony was not lost on some observers that silver, often called the poor man's gold, was creating rich man's problems for some of the world's most sophisticated financial operators, a reminder that markets can humble anyone regardless of experience or resources when conditions align in unexpected ways. As days stretched into weeks, the situation evolved from acute panic to grinding stress as dealers worked through their positions, some managing to source physical metal at painful but survivable premiums, others negotiating settlements with clients that involved sharing losses, still others finding creative solutions like temporary swaps or structured transactions that addressed immediate needs while deferring some costs to the future. The longer-term implications were becoming clear to everyone involved. The silver market was undergoing a structural transformation that would require new approaches to risk management, new relationships between dealers and physical suppliers, new contract structures that better accounted for the possibility of sustained physical premiums, and potentially new participants as industrial users that had always relied on dealers to manage their silver supply began contemplating whether they needed to secure their own sources through long-term contracts with mines or even equity investments in mining companies. The investment community, always alert to dislocations that create opportunity, began circling, with some seeing the chaos as a chance to profit from volatility, while others saw strategic opportunities to build new businesses that could serve the market better than the traditional dealer model, perhaps by vertically integrating physical sourcing with trading operations, or by developing new financial instruments that better reflected the reality of physical supply constraints. or by creating platforms that brought buyers and sellers together more efficiently than the opaque broker-dealer model that had dominated for generations. Technological solutions were proposed, blockchain-based tracking systems that could improve transparency in physical silver flows, AI-driven analytics that could better predict supply disruptions, even discussions about whether synthetic silver or alternative materials could substitute in some industrial applications, though these longer-term solutions did nothing to address the immediate crisis that dealers faced. The human dimension of the crisis was perhaps most compelling, because behind every failed hedge and blown-up position were actual people making consequential decisions under enormous pressure. And while it's easy to caricature dealers as greedy financiers deserving of whatever misfortune befalls them, the reality was more nuanced. Many were skilled professionals doing their best to serve clients and manage risk in a market that had always been challenging and had now become nearly impossible. And while some would undoubtedly fail and face severe consequences, others would adapt and survive, emerging from the crisis with hard-won lessons and perhaps even opportunities to thrive in whatever new market structure emerged from the chaos. Historical parallels offered some comfort because markets have faced similar disruptions before and have always eventually found equilibrium, though the path to that equilibrium often involved significant pain for those caught on the wrong side, and there was no guarantee that the equilibrium would look anything like the previous steady state. Indeed, it seemed increasingly likely that the silver market of the future would operate under very different assumptions and with very different participants than the market that had existed before this crisis. As the immediate panic began to subside, replaced by the long hard work of managing through the crisis, some dealers began to reflect on what had gone wrong, not in a spirit of self-flagellation, but in genuine attempts to understand how so many smart, experienced people could have been so wrong about something so fundamental. And the emerging consensus was that they had fallen victim to a cognitive bias that afflicts experts in any field. The tendency to assume that the future will resemble the past, that relationships that have held for decades will continue to hold, that the hard-won experience and intuition developed over careers provides reliable guidance even as underlying conditions change. And this crisis was a brutal reminder that in markets as in life, the only constant is change, and survival requires not just expertise but humility, not just confidence but constant questioning of one's assumptions. Not just the courage to act, but the wisdom to know when action is insufficient and adaptation is required. The silver alert dealers who had panicked that morning, those professionals whose world had been upended by forces they had failed to fully anticipate, were learning these lessons in the hardest possible way, through losses and stress and fear, but they were learning them nonetheless, and those who survived would emerge changed, perhaps chastened but certainly wiser, carrying forward into whatever came next the knowledge that markets can surprise anyone, that structural shifts can invalidate decades of experience, and that the price of participation in these complex systems is eternal vigilance coupled with the humility to admit when you don't have all the answers, a combination that might not guarantee success, but at least offers a fighting chance at survival when the next crisis, the next panic, the next moment of market chaos inevitably arrives.